Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. This episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Wondrium. This is the former Great Courses. You've heard me talk about them many times. I was just listening to an audiobook on the Federalist Papers. That is, I was just listening to the Federalist Papers themselves and realized I had no idea what the context was for why all those documents were written, all those essays. That became the founding papers of our Constitution. So I went to Wondrium, and there was an entire course on the Federalist Papers. That is, under their subject of books that matter, they're calling the Federalist Papers a book of sorts. And so here's a perfect example of how wonderful this online subscription program is. You have access to hundreds and hundreds of courses, each of which have dozens of lectures, like these dozen on the Federalist Papers. The Blueprint for American Government, a Democracy or a Republic, a Federation or a Nation, American Federalism, Dual Sovereignty, Popular Sovereignty, and States' Rights, constantly coming up. Anyway, you get the idea. You can click on any of these and watch them or stop watching them, skip to the next one. That amazingly, it remembers where you were in the lecture. I know that doesn't sound amazing to most people that are more tech savvy than me, but I find that very useful because I'll skip around and come back and pick up where I left off there. So here's the deal. They are, as our sponsor, you get a free trial, a month free trial to Wondrium. You just go to wondrium.com, wondrium.com/Shermer. And that's it, Shermer, wondrium.com/Shermer. Get you a free month trial. Give it a shot. Okay, this episode is with Heather Hine and Bret Weinstein and their new book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, Evolution and the Challenges of Modern Life. Most of you will know who Heather and Bret are after their encounters with the woke ideology at Evergreen. They've gone out on their own. They are now popular podcasters, and this is their first popular book on the subject of evolution in the modern world. They've been invited to speak and address the U.S. Congress, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Education, and have spoken before audiences across the globe. They both earned PhDs in biology from the University of Michigan, where their research on evolution and adaptation earned awards for its quality and innovation. They've been visiting fellows at Princeton University, and before that, they were professors, as I mentioned, at Evergreen State College for 15 years. They resigned from Evergreen in the wake of 2017 campus riots that focused in part on their opposition to a day of racial segregation and other college equity proposals. And they co-host weekly live streams of the Dark Horse podcast. I've listened to quite a few of their episodes. It's very illuminating. So we discuss in this conversation many topics of like diet and our physical bodies that evolved for one environment, living in a rather different environment, but mostly we talked about sex and gender and childhood, adulthood, school, education, all these things that we're encountering a rather stark mismatch between what we evolved to do, our minds that is, and our behavior, and what we're actually doing in the modern world, and how that causes many problems. And to their credit, they actually offer solutions, which I really like. Every chapter in the book has a little block of recommendations. Here's what you should eat or not eat, or here's how you should behave in this environment, or here's the different things you can try for have a better sleep or better diet or better relationships and so forth. So we get into the details of all that, as well as, of course, the larger issues of evolutionary psychology and to what extent we can understand human behavior currently in its very deep cultural bound state from an evolutionary perspective. Of course we can, and this is what they do in the book. So I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you will too. Thanks for listening. All right, Bret and Heather, nice to see you guys. It's been a long time. The last time I saw you, I think in person, was in Seattle.
Indeed.
I recall you bought me dinner.
Yeah.
You bought me dinner, and the principle of reciprocity. I've been thinking about this ever since. I got to see you guys again so I can return the favor.
Either that, or you could buy us virtual dinner.
Oh, there we go. Yes, that's right. I could do that. Okay, the new book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, Evolution and the Challenges of Modern Life. I am wearing my We Are All Africans t-shirt from the Richard Dawkins Foundation in honor of your book. Although, frankly, I'm not sure I should wear this out in public, given the current racialized, politicized culture we live in now, people would maybe accuse me of I don't know, incorporating somebody else's culture or trying to pretend that I'm black or I don't know what. But that's how far
we've could
come.
all agree on it, and yet it seems
Yeah.
to be that the only thing we can all agree on is that we can't all agree on anything.
True.
I was going to start this conversation in honor of your book with what I call Darwin's Dictum, which has guided my own writing for almost 30 years now. And this comes from a letter Darwin wrote to his friend Henry Fawcett, who had attended the British Association for the Advancement of Science conference in 1860, or 1861, which was discussing Darwin's new book on the origin of species. And Fawcett wrote to Darwin and said, they said it's way too theoretical. You should just put the facts out and let them speak for themselves. And he wrote back and said, how odd it is that anyone should not see that all observations must be for or against some view if it is to be of any service. And so let's start there. There's a lot of books on human evolution. What point of view is your book for or against in terms of this huge subject?
Well, there are a number of things that could be taken as the central theme, but I think probably the most central of themes is the idea that human beings at both a genetic and epigenetic, including cultural level, are adapted to the environments that our ancestors lived in and not the environment that we lived in, that human beings are, of all creatures, the best adapted to change, and yet our current rate of change as a result of the rate of technological progress has outstripped our evolutionary capacity to keep up. In other words, we are perpetually maladapted to our environment, and this is a process we will have to rein in if we're to thrive long term.
Just to follow that up, I would say to use the standard language of evolutionary biology. We often hear tell of the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, and that is, of course, what the title of the book is in reference to, that most people, when they think of the environment of evolutionary adaptedness of humans, think of the African savanna and the Paleolithic, right? And we argue in the book over and over and over again that, in fact, we, like everyone, but especially humans, with both our rapid rate of change and our great capacity for dealing with change and novelty, have environments of evolutionary adaptedness. And so we could have called it, an agriculturalist's guide to the 21st century, because we are also evolved to being agriculturalists, or a post-industrialist guide, or going farther back, a primate's guide, or a mammal's guide, or a fish's guide to the 21st century, because we are, we do retain parts of our fishy ancestry and parts of our mammalian ancestry and primate ancestry, and, forward and forward and forward.
Yeah. So let's talk about the difference between proximate and ultimate explanations. This comes up a lot in evolutionary psych circles. How do you distinguish or tell whether something is part of our deep evolutionary heritage or it's just something cultural that sprang up in the last few thousand years or even decades?
Well, the first thing to say is that we reject that dichotomy. And while it is fair to say that some traits are genetic and others are cultural, it is not fair to say that some traits are biological and others are cultural, because our culture is every bit as biological as our genes. It's effectively a second mode of transmission, a second place where adaptive information accumulates. And so once you begin to recognize that, and once you recognize that there is in fact a specifiable relationship between the cultural layer and the genetic layer, one can understand human adaptiveness much more clearly. In other words, we can look at traits that in some cases we can't tell where the information is housed, and in other cases the information is housed in different places. We can look at them and say, actually, well, irrespective of where the evolutionary adaptive information accumulated, the purpose must be the same. And by purpose, I don't mean the purpose that we should view as important, but the purpose that selection views as important. That purpose is the same for the genetic layer and the cultural layer.
And just to add on to that, I would say that the sort of culture versus biology dichotomy is one that we reject. It's all evolutionary, as you said, Bret. But the proximate versus ultimate level of explanation is one that we do, in fact, talk about in the book. And it's not one that we reject, although it's perhaps not as clean as many people would have it. And, that one is just a matter of sort of what level of answers are you interested in, or, potentially what level of questions are you posing? So, the ultimate level questions being ones of why, typically, and the proximate level questions being ones of how, of mechanism. And of course, all must refer to the other. Ultimate level questions must refer to the proximate mechanism, and proximate level questions should refer to the adaptive and deep history of why. Although too often in modern science, because it's so easy to get at the how compared to the why, too commonly modern science only deals with the how and not the why.
At the risk of going too far inside baseball, there's a historical divergence between the study of the proximate and ultimate layers that is really a matter of historical contingency. At the point that Darwin described the mechanisms of natural selection, it was simply not possible to look into the mechanisms inside of, for example, cells, and our ability to look even inside of animals was crude. So what that meant was that early evolutionists were hobbled by the scope of their tools, and they got in the habit of thinking in purely ultimate terms rather than the natural place, which is to say that the how and the why are different facets of the same question. And we can make the same argument on the other side, that as the science of cellular and molecular biology grew, it grew up largely in isolation from ultimate explanations. And we frequently read papers about cellular and molecular biology that, as they tread into evolutionary territory, make very little sense, because the culture of cellular and molecular biologists doesn't understand the significance and, in fact, the roadmap that is provided for understanding cells and tissues, for example, that is given by an understanding of selection. So one of our hopes is that actually there will be a renaissance of sorts where the proximate and ultimate questions begin to play better with each other, because there's an understanding in both of those academic cultures about the importance of the other.
So let's just use some examples. You talk in your book about diet, and the obvious simple mismatch that pretty much everybody acknowledges without any political taint is that, eating a lot of sugars and fats made sense in our ancestral environment because there weren't very many. And the more you could get, the better, because who knows when famine is coming next. In today's world, obviously, that's not a problem, but now we have an obesity and diabetes problem. Okay, so everybody kind of nods. Yeah, that makes sense. There's an evolutionary explanation for that. But then if you go to something like sex differences, men are more promiscuous than women, or men prefer more partners than women, and so on. And then all of a sudden, people go, "Hey, wait a minute now. You're claiming that men can't help it, and here you get the kind of blank slate arguments like no, those are more cultural differences." So how do you kind of weave through those issues?
Yeah, well, I mean, we could go on forever on this, and maybe in fact we will, the three of us here today. But I guess I would start off by saying it's of course also true that men and women have different optimal diets, as we talk about in the book. Just to take what should be not political and what generally is not politicized diet, and say, there is no universally best diet for humans, but that is in part because what's best for us changes over our lifespan and over particular things that happen to us, and part of that is about the different constraints and needs that men and women have, just in terms of our anatomy and physiology. And so we can acknowledge that somehow. We can talk about, for instance, higher rates of osteoporosis in women, especially postmenopausal, than in men. And then as soon as we're talking about things that seem to emerge from the brain as opposed to neck down in the body, or that exist in the interstitial spaces between individuals, suddenly it's not evolutionary anymore. And frankly, this is a faith-based perspective. To say that sure, evolution exists but not neck up or not in behavior is moving from a science-based understanding of the universe to one that is faith-based. And that's fine if that's your take, but you really would need to acknowledge that what you've now done is move into a faith-based framework.
It is also important to enter into this discussion each and every time with a recognition of just how ancient the division between male and female is, and just how it is not perfectly consistent. There are certainly species which provide examples that run counter to the norm, but even those cases, if you look deeply into them, tell the same story. So, to take your example, Michael, of a different view between males and females about number of sex partners or promiscuity, this is such a deep pattern that it can even be found inside of a single flower that has both male and female parts, right? The female
Wow.
parts actually put the pollen grains, that is to say the male gametes, to a test, and a long corolla tube that involves long pollen tubes growing to reach the ovules. That is effectively like the coyness of the female parts of the plant. It is a reluctance about sex, and it is a requirement that pollen grains demonstrate the capacity to reach the ovules, whereas pollen is more or less indiscriminate. Wherever it lands, it tries to fertilize because it has nothing to lose. And so
pollen being the stripped down, no cytoplasm gamete of plants that in animals we call sperm.
Right. So any evolutionary biologist who is being honest has to recognize that there's simply no room for controversy here. This is not a pattern that has anything to do with humans. And if we want to make the argument, and in fact, Heather and I do make the argument, that human mating strategies need a renegotiation because they're a bad fit for modernity. So we can't just simply do what our evolutionary past has led us to. But nonetheless, even that renegotiation has to take place in the context of this very ancient dichotomy that originally goes back to the very simple fact of large sessile gametes versus small mobile gametes having different strategic interests in mating, right? That's where this comes from, and it's hundreds of millions of years old.
Yeah, and we are never in the book, and we try to be very clear to never justify bad behavior or really any behavior. This is not justification, right? That we do not fall prey to the naturalistic fallacy in that way. What we're trying to do is explain so that we can be better going forward, all of us, right? And so just as Bret said, the evolution of sex happened something between 1 and 2 billion with a B years ago, and conservatively, within our lineage, that's been an uninterrupted lineage of, or history of sexual reproduction with 2 and only 2 sexes for at least 500 million years, and probably much longer than that. So, so we have sex evolving, and then we have, in not too long after that, the behavioral manifestations of sex evolving as well. And in non-human animals, we call that sex role. In humans, we call that gender, and gender is tightly aligned with sex. Not exactly, not perfectly. And the more variable you are, the more like humans you are in terms of being social and long-lived with generational overlap and long childhoods, all of these things. The more behaviorally labile you are, the more likely gender, sex roles, are to not exactly match onto what sex you are. And that's both fine and is in no way a rebuttal to the fundamental reality of binary sex.
So people with a stronger cultural emphasis on these things may say, well, you're excusing bad male behavior. Or the stronger argument, the blank slate argument, is that therefore we can't do anything about it. Boys will be boys, men will be men. So how do you respond to that kind of over-deterministic, if it's biology, I can't change it?
Well, again, I think one of the things that we hope people will come away from the book with is an understanding that culture is no less biological than genes, as I said before, but that the degree to which culture can be changed is much greater. In other words, there's a reason that our genomes offloaded the job of adaptive evolution in humans so substantially into the cultural layer. And the reason that they did that is that it allows much more rapid change. In other words, adaptation got put on fast forward as we shifted from a pre-programmed creature to a largely programmed after birth creature. What that means is that those things that we do find in the cultural layer are amenable to change, but it is not a blank canvas, right? There are constraints on what we can and cannot do. And in some sense, maybe the bitter pill that comes along with that good news is that the degree to which various behaviors and predispositions are flexible is somewhat arbitrary. There are things about our behavior that we can change almost effortlessly, and there are other things that we would struggle mightily to change and might not succeed. So, to take one obvious example, human beings regularly plan when and if to have children now. You would think a creature whose purpose was to produce offspring to get their genes into the future would have no capacity to override their instincts in this regard. But because selection happens to have placed the motivation for sex in a different location than it placed the behaviors surrounding it, technology allows us to separate the two things and to plan families, which has been tremendous from the point of view of the liberation of women, allowing women to join the workforce and take up whatever roles they choose to take up. It has been a tremendous boon to humanity in this regard. But what it has not done is altered the human compulsions, and especially male compulsions towards sex, especially sex that comes without commitment. And so these things, because they are housed differently, have different levels of flexibility. And once you can see that distinction, that we have little control over how much we desire sex, but we have a lot of control over the consequences of it, for example. And then you say, well, all right, how does this look across the rest of our behavior? What parts of our behavior are actually probably beyond our capacity to override our inherited evolutionary instincts, and which parts might be easily changed? And for the most part, we think it's good news. There's a whole lot of flexibility, and what we humans need to do and what we need to renegotiate in order to achieve our aspirations is largely within reach. But there are going to be some struggles, and we have to be ready for them.
Yeah, so like, for example, in your corrective lenses, and I should point out to listeners, each chapter has a little sidebar at the end in which you give advice. So here's your advice. Avoid sex without commitment, including sex for hire. Cheapening sex by seeking it everywhere and at all times renders it more difficult to form a stable bond with one individual. Isn't that more applicable to women than men, say? I mean, we know from evolutionary psych that men can have lots of sex without commitment, and they don't seem to be bothered by it at all, whereas women get more attached because of oxytocin and so forth. This is kind of the argument made.
Well, speaking as someone who identifies as a man, let me address that.
Yes, please
For which
do.
I am endlessly grateful.
Right. Well,
Yes.
So here's the thing that people ought to see. Men have effectively two mindsets with respect to sex, both of them evolutionary adaptations. In human beings, offspring are so labor-intensive to raise well that pairs that agree to raise offspring together outcompete individuals who attempt to raise offspring alone, who are typically women for obvious reasons. But the point is this: when men are choosing a partnership in which to raise children, they have every reason to be as choosy and careful about whom they partner with as women do. So men have a mindset, a sexual mindset, that is not the same as women, because women and men have different things that they risk in a relationship and different advantages that they can accrue, but they have a symmetrical level of choosiness. And then men have an additional way of reproducing that involves impregnating somebody and leaving. And so the problem for men is that that second way of reproducing, though it will not have been successful very frequently in history, except in the case of rape, frankly, and often rape took place in the context of warfare. But in normal mating, women are, because the risk of being forced to raise a child alone is so great and the costs so astronomical, women have been wired to be very careful about not reproducing without commitment. So when men are in the mindset of choosing a mate, they are similar to women in this regard, but because producing an offspring for which one has no responsibility is such an evolutionary bargain, men find it very hard to ignore that opportunity. So to the extent that the landscape, the modern landscape, seems to be filled with women who are willing to engage in reproductive behavior without commitment, men have a hard time finding the mindset in which they are choosy and careful and interested in all of the things that make for a strong partnership. So part of what we're up against is not really that men can't be corralled, it's that the modern environment provides so many outlets for men that seem superficially reproductive and do not involve commitment, and men are wired to be on the lookout for those opportunities. So the fact that those opportunities aren't really reproductive opportunities and don't lead to great fulfillment means that we have a kind of ongoing train wreck of sexuality where women who demand commitment have a hard time finding men because men have an easy time finding women who don't demand commitment, and it's all based in this very proximate level of reward. And our point in the book, which we hope does not fall on deaf ears, is that there's actually something quite rewarding to be discovered. It's very sex positive, but it is a different kind of reward than a desire to find a sexual partner for the night and not see them again.
And so we describe, as you alluded to, Bret, the sort of three strategies that have been historically possible, right? Mate with a partner for long-term engagement, mate short-term for reproductive advantage, but in which both partners are willing, and of course rape. And rape, everyone can agree, is not moral and should be off the table. But we're left with these two other strategies, which historically both have been available to men, and only one has been available to women. And one of the confusions, we argue, of sort of modernity and modern, third wave feminism and beyond, is that in order to be liberated, what women need to be able to do is to act like men at their worst, basically. Like we women need to be able to also access that short-term reproductive strategy that men have historically only had access to. And our argument is actually what liberation would look like is men and women both behaving like we do at our best, as opposed to sinking to a lowest common denominator, sort of sex for everyone at all times, which is branded with these good sounding things, like Bret said, sex positivity. Well, we argue that what we are actually advocating for is extraordinarily sex positive, but it's not about cheap sex. Junk sex.
Right. So as a PSA to men, would you then say, look, guys, I know you want to go out there and have all the sex you want, but the women you're going to have sex with are more likely to get attached to you than you are to them, unless you're taking this long-term strategy. So, be careful, or just don't do it. Just ride herd over your impulses. We are quite capable of doing that. I was thinking while you were talking of, I don't know if you remember Dr. Laura Schlesinger, the conservative right-wing talk radio host. Now she's on Sirius Satellite, so not everybody knows her. But so people would call in with the various problems. So I remember one episode where a guy called in and said, "I'm just addicted to porn. I just can't not watch porn. I just love it." And she goes, "Are you watching porn right now?" He goes, "Well, no, of course not." "Do you watch porn at work?" "Oh, well, of course not." She goes, "Well, apparently you can control it." He's like, "Huh, yeah." So I mean, even these things that are kind of base. Instinctive, we can have control over. And I don't want to go down the pathway of free will and determinism, but to me, volition comes from this awareness of what kind of influences impinge on our future selves, such that we can then manipulate the environment and say, okay, well, future Shermer's going to want that chocolate chip cookie tonight after 5 o'clock because I just want what I like. So I'm going to make sure there aren't any in the house. And then, right. Done. So in a way, I'm taking control of those impulses, and that's a kind of volition.
Yeah, no, I think this feeds right into, I believe we have in the book, the rat addiction experiments, which, point to the fact that the model in sort of drug addiction research for many years was some things are just addictive. Expose cocaine to people, and those people will become addicted to cocaine. And what research has demonstrated is Well, actually, not so much. Certainly, there is a physiological response to some things, and presumably that is true also for sex, for easy, cheap, abundant sex. But the more enriched your environment is otherwise, the less bored you are, to use a term that could endure a lot of definitional tweaking. But the less bored you are, the less likely you are to become addicted to the new thing, the junk thing that comes into your life, the junk sex, the junk entertainment, the junk food, whatever it is. Have an enriched life, and that can mean a lot of things, but you have more volition.
3 points. I'll try to remember them and make them brief. One, Heather and I had the advantage of teaching college students for 15 years, and because of the context that we taught them, we knew them very well and had all sorts of conversations. And one thing that is very clear is that the new radical sexual liberation in which commitment is not expected is not satisfying people, right? It is having men or women. It is having a different impact on men and women, but it's not like the men are actually happy with it. They have a hard time saying no to it, but they are not satisfied, and many of them are aware of the mismatch. Second thing I would say is there's a difference between being smart and being wise. And the problem of reining in your own desires is one of wisdom. That effectively wisdom has a very close relationship with delayed gratification. And the basic point is there's a reason you deny yourself that cookie, right, Michael? And it's because you're happier in the long run with who you are when you don't have access to that cookie.
I've got this
even
tire
though
roll
we all
around
agree
my
that
waist.
Right. So the point is you have overridden a short-term desire for the cookie for something better. And the thing that is, I think, a very hard sell in the modern environment, because effectively we have at least one industry hell-bent on selling the opposite message. But the thing that we ought to be telling young people is that actually there is something very satisfying, even for those desires that you're meeting with porn or Tinder or whatever else you're doing, that you are actually wired for a satisfying sex life that does involve commitment. And the problem is that it's actually just not simple to get there. So you're being sold a simple solution that doesn't work and doesn't satisfy you, and it's blocking you from finding something that would take work but ultimately would. So that's, to my way of thinking, a hopeful message, but it's one that's very hard to compel people, especially if they're already addicted, as you point out.
Is this why you're taking a stance in part against porn, or you're recommending in here, keep the porn down, keep children away from porn, but also, I guess your argument would be, is it distorts, particularly to males, what women really want? Because on porn, there's no plot, there's no storyline. It's just like, take your clothes off and fuck. And so guys watching this, maybe young men watching this, think, well, that's it. It's easy as that. And your point is, well, that's not actually what we evolved to do. So, but yet we know porn is just massively, 99% male consumption. And so the argument against pornography is, we did a whole issue of Skeptic on this, pro and con. On the one side, people are kind of libertarian, like whatever you want to do in the privacy of your bedroom is your business. If you two like to watch porn and get off on that, fine. Why should I, step in and tell you not to do that? But on the other hand, there are consequences. And it does change your perception, and so I guess a deeper point here would be, you guys are famous for being politically liberal, but here you sound like conservatives. This is what conservatives say. Like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this point we are consistent with another point we make in the book, which may also sound a little conservative, although increasingly. The tech world is coming around on the idea of, it's not just the algorithms that are being fed to us through the screens, but the screens themselves that are deranging. And so, on both the point with regard to porn and on screens to children, we make points that I think are new. And it is that when you engage with something that appears to be animate, but it doesn't respond to you, And so it is fixed in time and space. It cannot actually respond to the change in your affect, to the change in what you're doing. What you come to understand about that thing when and if you try to engage with it in real life, in the case of porn, with sex with an actual human being, or children in front of screens with any sort of organism that actually can respond in real life, is you become someone who doesn't actually recognize the full embodiment of the organism that you're interacting with, that it limits you, it limits your cognition because you have separated out perception from embodiment. And there is of course a whole literature on embodied cognition, and this slots into a prediction. We are making a prediction about what the deranging effects of porn and putting children in front of screens long term as a form of babysitter will have, which is that it will render those people less capable of engaging with the thing in question when they actually have the real full flesh and blood version in front of them.
I also want to add, you said that porn distorts what women want, and I want to make it clearly does, but it also distorts what men want radically. And the reason that it does that is because the driver of porn is economic. So if you have two companies trying to compete with each other for porn attention, they end up pushing sexuality in the direction of the extreme. That's the only way to stand out, right? So they inevitably tread into the taboo. And this really goes back to the first point we were discussing. Things that are taboo for an evolutionary reason. And we don't always know what it is, but sometimes we do, right? So for example, incest. There's a reason that incest is taboo. And the reason that incest is taboo has to do with deleterious recessive genes that are likely to come together if two close relatives produce an offspring, right? This is not a taboo we should be messing with. And yet one finds it in porn, right? So porn distorts what women want. It distorts what men want. But I would point out to your question about whether or not this is a conservative position. It's not a conservative position. I would say erotica is all well and good. It has a long history. It is a totally valid form. And to the extent that modernity requires some kind of exploration of sexuality that people can access, there's no critique in the book about erotica. The problem is the market forces being allowed to invade our sexual lives is distorting the way we interact with each other. And it is actually, from, again, the conversations that we had with students, it is turning people into brutal creatures who, as Heather points out, do not understand each other as deserving of compassion. Right? This is not the normal way sex is supposed to function. It's not healthy for us. It is not serving us in the workplace. When people have treated each other brutally while having sex as a result of the fact that porn has convinced them that that's the way sex is, and then they try to work side by side and be decent to each other, obviously it's going to create a problem. So anyway, it's if you listen carefully, the fact that we are unambiguously anti-porn has nothing to do with conservatism. It has to do with the fact that porn is a danger to us. And that is not, you can separate. It is the business model that makes it dangerous, not the sexuality.
Yeah, but so like conservatives will say something like, but especially with women, but both men and women, wait till you get married before you have sex, or at least put a ring on it. Have a commitment. Wasn't that Beyonce song? Put a ring on it. She's talking to women. Don't just have sex with these guys. That's not going to do it. They'll take advantage of that, but you'll lose in the long run. I had Heather McDonald on the show. I think you guys know her. She's pretty well known as a conservative, although a secular conservative. She's an atheist, but she makes the point that part of the problem with the campus hookup culture is that the old standards, where the default position was that the woman is not going to have sex with you tonight. Just assume that. Now, you can charm her, you can try, and maybe you'll get lucky, as the phrase is, but probably not. But she says in the late 60s and 70s, the default position switched to an opt out. That is, the assumption is that the woman is going to have sex with you tonight. So, lucky you, it's going to happen. Now, if she changes her mind, she has to then talk him out of it. And that, so now the burden is on her to show that the no really means no, and he's just assuming, well, I'm gonna, it's gonna happen. Oh no, now she's telling me no, and that kind of norm shift from like 1950s before, which we would call conservative, to now, actually was not a good idea. And so conservatives go, yeah, see, we've been saying this all along. So what you guys are saying is what we conservatives have been telling you for centuries. We need the 10 Commandments. You need religion. You need some kind of moral compass, a family structure, a hierarchy, a father that says you're not having sex until you get married. That's a very conservative position, which is in a way what you guys are saying. Well, the science does kind of support that.
No, gather round, conservatives. Here's the problem. You do have a point, but it's not as good as you think it is. We don't live in a world that will allow us to go back to the place where your point was strongest.
Nor should we want to.
Right, nor should we want to. The advantages that have come to us through modernization are many, but the hazards that have come to us are many as well. And really, the important thing is to recognize that we can separate them, right? We are not condemned to live this crazy, broken, incoherent life. What we can do is we can recognize that, yes, there's an awful lot in the past that made sense, much of which was dispensed with foolishly. And then there's a lot about the past that couldn't possibly be mapped properly onto the present. And so the correct thing to do is to say, well, what is the renegotiation? And frankly, we need to do that at a societal level, but people need to do that before society gets around to recognizing that that is the path forward. Individuals need to do this. And what we are waiting for is to see effectively a movement of young people who realize that they are being harmed by these things, who opt out together and effectively agree to live by other better rules. And, it's not that we're talking about monastic rules. We're talking about rules that actually will leave them more satisfied, happier, more successful down the road, but that require some effort. And, the number of young people we know who are at their wits' end because they haven't been left a decent option with the current, fashionable rules suggests that this movement is just waiting to happen. So I sincerely hope that we see it soon.
Well, maybe your book will be the blueprint, but the start of a new worldview that's neither conservative nor liberal. It's something else. That maybe that's part of your plan B. Maybe that's your next book. And one more subject on the issue of sex and gender, since we're also in the middle of this whole trans issue that's politicized. So how do you make sense of the fact that most fetuses or infants that are newborn that have a penis or a vagina, it's whatever it is, 99% probability it's going to identify as male or female, pretty predictable, but not 100%. So, of course, trans activists say the fact that it's not 100% means it's a continuum and you can be anything you want, or it's fluid or whatever. How does a evolutionary theorist think about those issues?
Well, we don't go into it in much depth in the book, but the short version is trans people are real. Trans is real. It's exceedingly rare. More than 99% of people who are actually male or female then act as male or female in life in all but the very modern, weird, all capitalized, weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies act as the sex to which they're born, whether or not they're gender nonconforming. Gender nonconformity is a totally different thing. And, I was gender nonconforming. A lot of people are gender nonconforming without ever having any dysphoria, without ever imagining that liking boy-style things, being athletic and mathy makes me a boy. Nope, never did, never would, never has. That said, trans people are real, extraordinarily rare. Trans activism is a modern thing that seems to have very little overlap with actual trans people. And the trans people we know, and again, in part because of our former roles as professors at an extremely liberal college, we knew a lot of trans students. Of course we did. The trans people we know hold no truck with trans activism. The trans ideology, which says a trans woman is a woman, no, she's not. We will have respect and provide environments in which people can live the lives in which they feel the truest to themselves without abandoning reality and without abandoning the hard-won rights of women and also of children and of homosexuals and all of the other groups who are put at risk by the ideology and the activism that is flying under the banner of trans now, but is actually, I would argue, no such thing.
Now, I would just add, there are numerous cultures in which it is apparent that transness is quite ancient, that it actually does exist. It is not a modern phenomenon, but again, exceedingly rare. And what this implies is something that does not fit with the current fashion at all, but seems obvious in retrospect, which is that adults who reach adulthood and truly feel, I am just not right for the body I was born into, need to be protected, that they are experiencing something and it's a very difficult something, and we need to protect them. However, we also need to recognize that some of the ways in which we now see trans rights are modern. They do not have an ancient history. In other words, the fact of being trans may be ancient. The fact of surgery and pharmaceuticals that block hormone pathways are brand new. And so we have to figure out what the right way to utilize these things. But clearly, adults have rights to experiment on their own bodies in a way that children do not and should not, and we cannot experiment on them. And what's more, the evidence of a overwhelming fraction of children who do experience gender dysphoria having it clear up and ending up being happy adults in bodies that match their software suggests that we need to protect children from the trans activist fashion, which says we need to intervene early, surgically, and pharmaceutically.
Right. So there you're talking about dysphoria, say, when you're 5 or 3 years old. But now there's this trend, according to Abigail Shrier and a few others, again, they're conservative, saying, look, these teenage girls are getting on Facebook and they're being influenced by these YouTube influencers and Facebook groups that, they're actually trans and they should go ahead and get the hormone treatments and testosterone and the top surgery and all that stuff. And then, liberals are pushing back going, no, that's hugely exaggerated. And so then now there's this debate to what extent does screen time influence teenage, not just sexuality, but on everything. But I don't know if you've looked at that literature and what the science says about that.
Yeah. I don't think there's an exaggeration going on. I think, if anything, we don't know the full extent of it yet. And, one of the things that we are really pleased to be able to do is to talk across the usual political boundaries and, find people who see data, who see evidence, regardless of what things they may believe about how best to move forward in the world. And, I count Abigail Shrier as a friend. And so, just full disclosure there. Sure, our politics are different, but it doesn't matter. Our girls, girls and boys are different, right? We are all human, but girls and boys are different. And girls are much more likely to, especially at that moment in time when they're transitioning from childhood to adulthood, to be very, very focused on social group and belonging and tribe. And boys will do that via stereotypically, via more physical means and via contest that is more physical, more rule-based, more explicit, in which winner may take all, but winner is definitely revealed as winner. And females, girls in particular, but all females will be more likely to do this by social means, by covert means, and there's an abundant good literature on this as well. And so, and we see this, that the modern technology that is deranging boys and girls is different. Boys are much more likely to be gamers and thus much more likely to be less knowledgeable about how to interact in real time because they've spent so much of their time interacting through a screen on contest. And girls are much more likely to fall into social media and be confused by and confirmed by things that they see there. And in a moment when it's ever harder, I mean, especially given the last 18 months of less time in person because of COVID, um, girls are much more likely to be affirmed by claiming that they are something that is unusual. And trans is ever less unusual, frankly, but just being, especially, a middle-class white girl right now who may be straight is not something that is going to get as much attention as if you come out and say, actually, yeah, I'm trans. And that's much more likely if your friends have claimed that too, and if they've done that and you have been able to see how affirmed they were, how congratulated they were by a larger social group online.
Yeah, in other words, it's not that these girls want to be boys, they want to be trans.
Yep.
Yeah, and they want to
That's
belong.
well said.
I think, yeah, that's really good. Yeah.
Then, since you're also civil rights activists, how do you resolve the conflicting rights issues in this particular one? Male to female trans that want to enter girls' sports. Women fought, for decades to get their own divisions with equal prize money and so forth. And now these guys want to come in. Well, guys, okay, they're trans, whatever. And to me, that just seems unfair. But don't they have a right to have, compete like that? Maybe there's not enough of them to have their own division, which would be a simple solution, but there's just not enough. So then what do you do?
Well, the problem is that you have two different sets of rights in tension, and it is clear to us that we have to protect women's rights. And, women's sports is an obvious place for this, but it gets worse from there. The idea that you can go to a women's prison by simply declaring yourself trans, even if you're a sexual predator male, is preposterous. And so in order to protect the hard-won gains of women, we have to take a go slow, very cautious approach to anything that would degrade the categories, the protected categories that women rightly hold. So,
and the protected categories of male and female, which again are beyond ancient, and which are, certainly there's variety, there's variation within the hormone profiles of natal-born males and females, and the physiology and anatomy. And some women are taller than men, and some women are stronger than some men. This is all true, and it does not put the lie to the categories.
So on that issue of conflicting rights, you don't talk about abortion in your book, but I am curious because I'm pro-choice, but I'm open to talking to pro-lifers. What are your best arguments? And they have some good arguments. But here it seems like it's never going to be resolved. Science can't say, well, that's the correct answer. It ends up being kind of political. And yet science can advise, well, where do you draw the line? Maybe end of second trimester. It's really a person after that because it's viable outside of the womb, whatever argument you want to make. But it seems like it comes down to the rights of the fetus to live, the rights of the mother to choose. And just socially, we're just going to make a decision. Whose rights are we going to emphasize? And that's why you end up in these, polarizing debates. And now Roe v. Wade may be on the chopping block and so forth. How do you guys resolve that as scientists and rights activists?
Well, this actually mirrors many of our extremely polarized debates, where you would think from what you see in various publications and between our political parties that people are ferociously divided over these things, when in fact the vast majority hold a non-extreme position. Most people believe that there is some right to terminate a pregnancy, that a cluster of cells is not deserving of the same rights as a person. There are certainly those who would argue otherwise, almost always from the justification that that ball of cells has a purpose that was imbued by a deity that we do not all agree exists. But with the exception of those, most people believe there is some right to terminate a pregnancy, and most people get more and more troubled by the possibility of terminating a pregnancy the closer we get to the viability of that fetus. And frankly, even the moment of birth is arbitrary in one regard. A human child, is not self-sufficient at birth, right? We could make the same argument for other creatures, but we have to draw a line somewhere. Most of us agree that we have to draw a line somewhere, that it is appalling to allow abortion moments before birth. and that it is necessary that we allow the termination of a pregnancy that has not implanted in the uterine wall, right? So somewhere between those two, there's a line that has to be drawn. It will be arbitrary, but the overwhelming majority of us agree on that.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with both of you that I don't think science can get us there on this one. That there are two bright lines, demarcating lines that have just been referred to, which is to say conception and birth, and neither of those are the right lines at which to draw this. And so, viability, okay, but where and when, and it's different depending on the pregnancy, and viability isn't a bright line that you can draw at, say, halfway through the second trimester. Even our methods of counting how old a pregnancy are imprecise, if hopefully not inaccurate. So this has to be done at the social and political level, and I agree. I think actually, aside from some people who are anti-choice, who really feel that largely for religious reasons, any termination of any pregnancy by action by the mother is an abomination, the vast majority of us, and that really is the vast majority of the rest of us, actually recognize that some choice is useful and in fact necessary in a modern democratic society, but that imagining that we should be celebrating it or pushing it into the third trimester is actually also something that most of us are not on board with.
And I think I have to say, as you point out, Michael, Heather and I are lifelong committed liberals, progressives. But I far more easily understand the perspective of those who believe there is no right to terminate a pregnancy. I don't agree with them, but I understand that this is a technological innovation, and it is not obvious that we should have access to it. It becomes obvious when you begin to think through it, if you do not imagine a divine purpose. But nonetheless, I understand the argument that this is going to be a person, and your right to decide it isn't, is new, which it, in some sense is. Whereas I can't say that I understand the person who feels no compunction about aborting a child that has reached viability, right? I find something troubling about that idea. And so, again, I would say there is something to be said for the idea that over in the land of conservatives, there are some ideas that are not fully fledged, but that have merit, and that are hard to hear for those of us over here on the left. And it is time that we begin to sort these things. Neither side is in a position to declare victory, having been right? But there are elements of the truth on both sides, and that conversation could be it could be a watershed event if we could get there. And to the extent that we are fiercely polarized and not able to get there, I have to ask the question of whose bidding are we doing?
Yeah, like conservatives like Dinesh D'Souza makes the point that when a woman gets pregnant and she wants to have a baby, she doesn't describe it as fetal tissue for which she's going to have a medical procedure in 9 months. She says, "This is my baby." And yet a woman that gets pregnant that doesn't want to be pregnant, then they use different language like fetal tissue. So I think the problem, one approach I've taken with conservatives is that the problem isn't abortion so much as unwanted pregnancies. Why are women getting pregnant when they don't want to? And so you only have to look historically. Well, the technology wasn't there until 1960s and the pill and so forth, and reliable reproductive technologies. But before that, it was women just didn't have power or education, economic empowerment, decisions, choices that they could make. And so infanticide was actually quite high before before 1900. So it's going to happen anyway, right? So why not just try to reduce the problem at the other end? Why are women getting pregnant when they don't want to? Well, education, economic empowerment, access to birth control that's either cheap or free, and so on. That'll reduce it way down. There's pretty good evidence for this. That in countries that do this, that it never gets to zero or close to that, but certainly the numbers we see of that conservatives like to cite, the number of murders of children, as they call it, babies in the womb, is astronomical. Okay, but it's going down with when you impose these other conditions in which women have more power and choice. Anyway, that's just kind of how I approach it and trying to make common ground with conservatives so it's not so politicized. We should point out that if Roe v. Wade ever gets overturned, it just sends it back to the states. Each state will decide. Of course, the problem is that if they're Southern religious-based states, they're gonna ban it altogether, and that's the problem. But anyway, that's kind of a sidebar because it's such a hot button issue these days. But on your subjects of let's shift to childhood, parenthood, and so on. You guys are parents, as am I, and on this issue of teen anxiety, increasing rates of depression. You talk about some of these issues in your book about mental health and so forth. And before, we can't count the last 18 months because of COVID. It's just that everybody's leading crazy lives now. But before that, there was a Gene Twangy track, the spike in teen anxiety and depression, self-cutting, suicidal ideation, like double that in girls than boys, or so on. So the question was, is it too much screen time, too much Facebook, too many like buttons to push, or whatever? What are your thoughts on that? What would you recommend parents do with their teenage kids and the screen time?
The answer is it's hyper-novelty that's doing it. And the problem with that answer is it is right and does not tell you how to correct the problem. It tells you what direction to go, but it does not tell you, and I must tell you, as parents, we have succeeded as well as I think could be hoped, but we have not completely succeeded because modernity is everywhere. And unless you want to raise your children, effectively Amish, you have to draw a line somewhere, and the line is an unacceptable one.
Well, I mean, in fact, when our children are now 17 and 15, and when they were younger, we joked that we were raising them Amish, and that, that we sent them to school to get socialized, we educated them at home, and that we were raising them as Amish as possible. And before we had fully developed the language around hyper-novelty and exactly what it was that we were pushing against, we were looking back. And this is a point, of course, that Lukianoff and Haidt make in their coddling of the American mind. But the sort of perfect storm that's been emerging now for, I don't know, depending on how you count it, 10, 15, 20 years of the screen time for the children. Yes, just the screens, and then also the algorithms, but also the legal drugs that are being given to children. And there was sort of there has been a move away from a lot of the anti-anxiety and antidepressant meds for girls and speed for boys. Unfortunately, that began to switch towards some of these cross-sex hormones with the rise in trans ideology. But giving developing brains and bodies these incredibly powerful drugs and expecting them to develop into fully fledged normal human beings later on as if they'd never had those drugs is wishful thinking at best. And then, of course, the parenting styles of sort of helicopter and snowplow parenting, in which you protect your child from all possible harm, such that you have almost a perfect guarantee that they will arrive at 18 alive. But they're going to be children. Their minds are going to be those of children. And so, there's more, of course, but those three things, the parents that protect their children from all physical risk and therefore mental and psychological and intellectual risk as well. The drugging of children, the legal drugging of children that basically keeps them from developing their own ability to mitigate and moderate their own moods, and then allowing them access to screens and the algorithms on them that further deprave their abilities to think through things, especially when there's market forces involved, which of course the algorithms are all about market forces. So let your children experience risk, but let it be real risk. Don't drug them and keep them away from as many screens as possible. Those are a few sort of early interventions, I guess I would call it, but it does harken back to an older time and we can say that without feeling like conservatives doing so, right? It's just about recognizing what childhood is. Childhood is a time of exploration. We have the longest childhoods on the planet for our lifespan of any organism. And what is that? That is the many, many years during which humans are learning how to be human. So let's let that happen. Let's not pretend that they're little wrapped presents that should never be experiencing the world. Because if you do that, they're gonna land at adulthood incapable of being adults and demanding safety and trigger warnings and all the rest every place they go.
I would also say to the extent that you cannot bar the bad influences from your kids' lives, delay them as long as you can. That really, the more development is behind you at the point that you encounter the bad influences, the less it's going to alter you. And, it's amazing how well that seems to work. Our children have, they've been through some very unusual experiences given what happened to us in 2017 and has not stopped happening to us. And they do not suffer from anxiety. They're very clear-headed, honorable, good kids. At this point, they both have phones. Neither one is addicted to their phone. So anyway, there's a lot to be said for delaying the bad influences as long as possible. And frankly, I think one of the things that we have, not only did we talk to our children like adults from before they were able to talk themselves, which is an odd choice. I find it a little hard to defend, but I'm pretty sure it worked well. But we have also been incredibly honest with them about what is taking place in the world, what its potential implication is for them, about the hazards that they face. We have talked to them very openly about porn and what we think it risks.
We have two boys, so it's more relevant than it might be.
It's relevant, and frankly, if you don't talk to them, then they will encounter it and they won't understand what it is and what hazard it poses. We've been very honest with them about drugs, sex, drugs, rock and roll. We've talked to them about all of it. And I can say, we have two anecdotes that nonetheless make a pretty compelling case that in a confusing era like the one we have, full of novel influences that are hazardous, the best thing you can do is share your thinking with them and hope that they will help you navigate it, because you can't navigate it on their behalf.
Yeah. Hey, so for my listeners, while we're on that, they're all going to know who you are, but maybe they haven't caught up from what happened after 2017. You left Evergreen, and then what happened? What are you doing now? Just kind of give us a quick update.
That's a good question.
I think we're talking to you, Mr.
Shermer. Our joke to ourselves is that we got picked up by a tornado in 2017, and it hasn't put us down since. And then it seems to have picked the rest of you up too at some point in the last few years.
A different tornado.
So yes, in effect, the scientific language might be that we crossed over an event horizon, and our current lives could not have been predicted from our pasts. But I think that's true for all of humanity at the moment, right? We are now in the midst of historical events, and we do not know how they will play out, but everybody is now feeling that. And I guess I don't know how to answer your question. I think we went
I guess pragmatically speaking, you have a popular podcast, you have a popular book that comes out this week when we release this. And so you're able to make a living, not as professors anymore, but or renegade professors, or professors without a home, or I don't know what you call it, I forget what you call it. But you're still in the process, in the business of educating people, which is, what is school? What is education?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go. The book emerges from over a decade of thinking. And in fact, I can remember a moment in 2010 when I was teaching a comparative anatomy lab, talking to students, and I know who they were is how I can place it in time, exactly about the title that we already had, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, and what we were imagining might be in the book. And so obviously this thinking has been simmering for a long time, and many of the ideas in the book were things that we were playing with our students. And, neither of us imagined that we're going to be full-time in the classroom or in the field with students again. And that's fine, actually. But we were both kind of amazed and surprised when we became professors and chose a school that was really about teaching rather than about explicit research, that focused on the educational aspect of higher ed as opposed to the research aspect, how much we loved it and how much it really was rewarding. And the only way that it wasn't really rewarding was that it didn't scale, that we could really deeply reach and come to know 25 or 50 or very occasionally 75 students at a time, just because of the student-faculty ratio and how many people you were teaching with. That was true at Evergreen. it was wonderful. And one of the things I've said is that teaching at Evergreen made me less of a misanthrope, that I came to really appreciate and love humanity much more than I had before, because almost every single student that I had revealed something new to me that I didn't know before and that I could then have with me going forward. And especially in an era when so many interactions are online, that's really hard to recognize, right? Like when you see so much banal, garbage, trollish behavior, and even good people behaving in ways that they never would if they were one-on-one with you, it can be hard to remember that actually almost everyone has something unique and valuable to offer in the world. And so, we do have one chapter on school in the book. It was one of the places that got crunched down because we were going to do sort of a K through 12 chapter and a higher ed chapter, because we do have so much to say about what it has felt like to actually be educators that reach students effectively, and then transitioning to doing a podcast is both not at all like being with students whom because we have just tens of thousands of anonymous viewers. We know a few of them at this point because we do Q&As and we see regular people asking questions, but for the most part we still don't know anything about them. And the best education, like aside from what you're doing with your podcast and what we're doing with ours and what people are trying to do when they write articles that just go out into the ether, actual education involves getting to know something about the brains and bodies of the people with whom you are interacting. What are their aspirations? What is their development? What is true of what it is that they hope to accomplish in the world? And that's impossible to do with most modern educational environments because teachers just have way too many students, or they have too little time with them, or both.
Yeah, speaking of evolutionary mismatch, I mean, how normal is it to cram 25 students into a classroom with rows of desks and the teacher standing at the podium yammering away and they're supposed to take notes? And, this just is so artificial. And as far as I know, the research shows that's not really a good way to learn. They need to interact. They need to actually do things. And so the kind of education you had that you were doing at Evergreen, can that scale up to a UCLA with 45,000 students? Something like that.
Right. Our system is built around economic efficiency. That's really the only defense for the rows of chairs facing what I cannot shake the feeling is the cave wall with the professor up there, putting yes. drawings on it. There's no good defense from the point of view of educating minds or making people more capable, which is why Heather and I spent so much time in the field, both domestically and abroad, and engaged in activities that educated that were not fully abstract. That the fully abstract education is a hazard to thought.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, well, so I have a 5-year-old now. I have a 30-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son. So I'm kind of revisiting those early days. He's supposed to start kindergarten next week. And my wife and I are just kind of baffled. Like, well, he's been with us all day, every day for 5 years. And now he's got to go and be in this classroom. Well, we found a nice Montessori school. So there's no rows of desks. So we like that. But why does he have to stay until late afternoon? And the answer seems to be because the parents have jobs and they can't pick him up until then. It's like, so this is just babysitting, but I work for myself. Yes. I can pick them up anytime I want. Why can't I just pick them up at noon? Oh, well, no, we have our system. Like, okay, that seems artificial.
Yep.
Yeah, it really is. And, school is brand new. And not only is school brand new in human evolution, no other species really do school, and very few species actually teach explicitly, but even most human cultures don't do this kind of explicit formalized teaching. And indeed, there are a lot of things that people learn how to do that seems like it would require direct instruction that actually does not, where direct instruction is actually forbidden by the culture, and it's done by trial and error, by observation and then trial and error. And so this idea that everything that must be learned from a teacher in a formal educational setting is absurd. That's not to say that there aren't some things that are best learned that way. things like, calculus and molecular biology. And in fact, if you have a
Yeah.
good teacher and a small enough group, and you can actually engage ideas and go back and forth and see where you disagree and why and what disagreement sounds like and how it is that you can explore both disagreement over fact and disagreement over emotion, is incredibly educational. But that doesn't mean that that is the setting that is necessary for all of the things that you should want to learn in the world.
I think the way to think of it is school for modern people. School is a necessary supplement to education.
Right. Do you recommend homeschooling to parents, particularly now with the pandemic?
Really depends on whether the parents are in a position to do it. And frankly, if you are in a position to do it, there's probably an argument to be made for pooling your efforts with others who are in a position to do it so that you don't, because, we saw a lot of really intelligent, well-educated, homeschooled kids at Evergreen.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say it was rarely without some sort of evident cost. The insulation from other kids or the subject in which the parent was not proficient and therefore left a deficit, those things were present. And so what one wants to do, yes, maybe the ideal kind of schooling would be homeschooling with parents who were well equipped to do it and who teamed up with others so that basically they created a highly personalized, effective curriculum that covered everything. That would be great. Now, most people are not in a position to do that. But if you are, it's hard to imagine that anybody is going to be able to take the kind of interest in your child's cognitive and other well-being the way you can. So, yeah, homeschooling can be bad, but it could also be the best schooling if done well.
Yeah, and like you said, we saw a lot of people who had been homeschooled who were extraordinary. Some of the best think outside the box thinkers.
Really?
We saw, in fact, among our
But
students.
aren't most homeschoolers religious? In America, anyway, isn't this
None
kind
of
a
ours
religious
were.
group?
Yeah,
and
we didn't see that.
I mean, I think
Really?
that's certainly the stereotype, and I think that is a category of homeschoolers for sure. But there are a whole lot of other people, including a lot of people who come from the left, frankly, who are homeschooling. And the particular college we were at was a liberal college in the Pacific Northwest, and so it shouldn't be surprising that to the degree that we had homeschooled people, they weren't coming from religious homes in the South.
It's interesting because people on the left tend to be more favorable to government programs like public schools. We need public education. That's a pretty common liberal position to take. But what would be their motivation to homeschool then?
Well, actually, I heard you peering into that very rabbit hole a minute ago here, right? You were talking about the incoherence of the structure of the classroom, and then I heard you talking about the fact that it seemed to you that the hours had been rigged around protecting a job that you don't have to go to, and so then at some point, if you add into that a sprinkling of what kind of woke nonsense are they now going to load into my child's mind, at some point you're going to decide, well, geez, my kid is probably better off if I just put the actual material in front of them, help them work their way through it, and maybe find some other kids whose parents see it the same way.
Yeah, I mean, add to that sprinkling, oh my God, the testing and the preparing for testing is taking up way too much of the curriculum, and at cost of now there's no recess, now there's no arts programs. Now they still claim there's science and math, but in general, it's from teachers who weren't prepared well enough because instead they had to sit through ed classes, education classes, rather than actually learning how to be good scientists or mathematicians. So, I have rarely met a teacher who didn't get into the profession for the right reasons and who really, really wants to teach students well. But the modern educational system ties teachers' hands so successfully that I think the students who we had who'd been homeschooled had, often it was sort of like hippie liberal parents who also may have been constrained by, we're actually itinerant in a good way, like intentionally itinerant. We're going to be on the road, and so we're going to teach you, our children, as we explore the United States or Latin America. And so there was, a travel component of the education as well. So those are also reasons to end up choosing homeschooling.
And if I took conservatives to task earlier, if I can take liberals to task, gather
Yeah,
around,
please.
liberals. The fact is that government is an absolutely necessary evil, and government is not inherently good. Governance is necessary, but good governance is what we should be after. And to the extent that what we have is captured malignant government, it is a problem. That is the thing that is choosing how to educate our children, and it is not working out well. Anyone can see that. So what we really, as liberals, ought to be thinking is how can we recapture those structures and return them to the job of good governance, including high quality education for our children, which really couldn't possibly be a higher priority.
Right. But so then what? Just more money. What you typically hear is, well, we just need more money to pay teachers and better facilities at the schools and so on.
That's your malignant government talking, right? And so the first step, and again, it's not an easily operationalized thing, but the first step is to recapture those structures from the things that have taken them from us and to return them to the purpose of our collective well-being. And so, for people your age or our age, Michael, we barely remember governance that wasn't fully malignant, right? It exists in our memory, but it's been a while. And the fact is, what that means is for young people, they actually don't realize, they cannot intuit the fact that governance could be anything other than what it is, which is appallingly inept at best and actually doing someone else's bidding at our expense more often than not. So in some sense, we need to tell the young, actually something else is possible, right? I don't think any of us here saw real good governance, but we saw hints of it. We know that it's possible. And to the extent that we don't have that, we have something that masquerades as good governance while it's doing the bidding of special interests. It has to be our focus that we regain control of it. Otherwise, this is going to be a short ride given the kinds of technologies that we are now playing with.
My wife's from Germany. She moved here 7 years ago to be with me, which I'm still astounded and think she made a big mistake. Let's not tell her that. But one of her observations is she's just amazed at how obsessed Americans are with sex and race. It just comes up over and over and over. And I keep telling her, no, this is just an aberration. The pendulum's going to swing back any day now. And all this critical race theory and gender wokeness, our little guy's not going to be exposed to. It'll all be gone. And pretty much every month she goes, yeah, when's that going to happen? Because it seems to be getting worse. Yes. Is it really getting worse?
No, that's a beautiful, a gorgeous delusion, Michael. I really hope it somehow turns into a reality. But no, look, here's the thing. It can't go on forever. That's the good news. On the other hand, it could undermine everything that works on the way to its collapse. And then what, right? I mean, really, this is the biggest problem, is that even if you believed this nonsense, if you pursue it and you inflict it on our medical schools and our engineering schools and our schools of education and every other structure that once upon a time worked, what you're ultimately going to do is throw the gates of the city open to our antagonists abroad. That's not going to be a fairer world. That's going to be a brutal, terrible world. So in some sense, those of us who understand that as flawed as the American experiment is, it's a brilliant experiment. We have to rescue it. The world needs us to rescue it. And we are playing with fire.
Well, just to transition to that by way of a specific example here, we see a lot of nannies at the playgrounds where we take our little guy to. And, well, where's the parents? Well, they're at work, both of them, all day. So, on the one hand, I think, well, what do they have kids for if somebody is paying somebody to raise their kids? But on the other hand, I feel like, well, maybe I'm the lucky one because I'm largely self-employed and have a lot of free time to structure my work schedule, so I can do that. Most people are not lucky that way. Well, why is that? Well, this gets to your final chapters in your book. Well, we have this economic growth model in which, at this point, it really takes 2 full-time incomes if you have 1 or 2 kids and you want to have a decent house and an education and a car and on and on. That's just what it takes. So, what we're talking about here may not even be practical if that's the model, the economic model we've kind of forced to go into.
Yeah,
That's right.
the economic model is a dead end. We can say that from here. And the smart thing to do when you're accelerating towards a dead end is figure out how to gently transition to something that does not have you colliding in whatever they have at the end of the road. So yeah, we have to. And that's a hard sell, right? That we need to be focused on something other than growth, right? That sounds like austerity to people. But the point we make in the final chapter of the book is that it does not have to be austerity, and that in fact, I don't know how intentional it was. It may be a pure accident, but whatever it is that has us condemned to attempt to generate more different kinds of growth as the kinds of growth that we have already generated peter out, that thing has sold us a false bill of goods. And that in fact, if we recognized what the problem is, that we must solve it, and we started figuring out how to transition to a system that was sustainable, that would actually be a very vibrant age, right? If you lived in the age in which we figured out how to stop doing this thing, which has been so successful but cannot continue, and figured out how to do the thing that we must do next, there would be no shortage of useful, meaningful things to throw your efforts into, right? Suddenly we would be able to explain to our children why they were going to school and what sorts of jobs they might have, right? Their jobs might be the jobs of innovators who figure out how to solve problems that are important. And why we are staving off that transition really makes no sense. And the only thing to be said is that in some sense, if you're very successful in the current system, you may fear the transition to another system in which you might not be on top. But we can't let people who have succeeded in a system that is self-terminating dictate whether or not we switch to another system. Whatever must be done, we really don't have a choice.
Right, but we're talking about this from a 30,000-foot perspective, back to the parents that say, hey, we got to have two jobs. It's our budget. Are you suggesting I move to Idaho and have a little small ranch or something where land is much cheaper and don't have a car? And I mean, what are we talking about here?
Well, first of all, let's just recognize that as terrible as the pandemic has been, and it has been, not only is this a terrible disease, but the pandemic and its effects on the way we function has been quite terrible, but it has revealed a lot about what in our system was not necessary. And so to the extent that a lot of what needs to be done can now be done from anywhere, it does suggest that maybe there's a way to scale back one's needs by not necessarily living in a place where the real estate forces you to have that second job. And, I wouldn't pretend that we know how to restructure things, but I certainly hear lots of people in our social group who have discovered that they don't need to be where they thought they needed to be, and suddenly their employer doesn't have the same obsession with them physically showing up at work because it's been demonstrated that work can be done remotely. And so I do think people's quality of life could remain high and even become higher as they reorganized how they participated in the labor force.
I guess I would just I would take issue with just one thing you just said, which is the idea that people might recognize that they don't need that second job. That's a 1950s style of thinking, right? That the stable family that allows for the excellent childcare requires that one person be totally dedicated to the home and one person totally be dedicated to the external world, and that a way forward that looks more modern can allow potentially for flexibility in the work that is meaningful for both of the adults in the family, and then also allow for both of the adults in the family to actually do meaningful childcare. We were lucky enough. Our jobs at Evergreen were flexible enough, and we had very part-time childcare on campus that we were both able to have our jobs and our children, and it didn't feel like sacrifice to either of them, and that was good luck, and most people don't have those kinds of jobs. But I do think that employers should be able to see the few good things that this last 18 months has revealed, and say, okay, grant people more flexibility. And if they say, actually, I want the 30 hours rather than the 40 hours a week, so that I can also be an active parent, then let's move forward with that.
Okay, let's wrap it up. Just give us some final thoughts on the very end of your book on freedom and justice in a trade-off in a society like this. How do you think about that?
Well, the way to think about it is this. If you think about all of the worst episodes of at least recent history, they all result from somebody spotting some good that they want to maximize and not understanding that to maximize any single parameter is to cause every other valuable parameter to crash. We have to think in the opposite way. Civilization, to the extent that it works, is a balancing act where it takes each trade-off and modulates it so that what you get is the majority of the value without getting 100% of any value, because 100% of any value is the death knell to a functional feedback system. So what we are pursuing, and we say in the book, we do not know enough to blueprint the next system. We cannot tell you what it will look like, but we can figure out what direction it is in, and we can begin to prototype our way in that direction. That's what we should be doing, and we shouldn't fear it. To begin that process is to open the next chapter of human existence. It is likely to be an excellent chapter. It will certainly make things brighter almost immediately from where we are. We are in what an evolutionist would regard as an adaptive valley. It's a very dark place, but that is the necessary transition to something better. And it's time we got moving, because if we stay here, it won't last.
Right. Well, maybe that's your next book. Is there, what did you call it? Game B or Plan B? Yeah. No, that would be perfect. And if we ever do colonize Mars,
category.
Game B. Yeah, maybe you could take that to Mars when we send that to Elon when he sends his crew to Mars to colonize it.
We will not be going to Mars. Actually, we have done some research into Mars, and what many people do not realize about Mars is that it is a very boring place. So we advocate many people going to Mars.
Oh, yes.
We will be staying here.
All right. Thanks, guys. That was a great conversation.
We hope you do too,
and I love the book. It's a great book.